We'll call this meeting of Lima City Council to order. We'll begin tonight's meeting with the invocation by Councilor Glenn, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance.
All minds clear. Oh, Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you so much for having all of us here gathered today, Lord. Bless every city council. Bless the administration. Lord, I thank you for all the blessing you have given me in the sixth ward, Lord. Continue all the blessing, Lord. Lord, I pray for the family, Lord, who have a deceased there, Lord. Lord, we thank you for all you have done with the collecting of the money for a funeral, Lord. We thank you, Lord. Just keep blessing the city of Lima, Lord, and lead us in the right direction we need to go in tonight, Lord. In Jesus Christ's name, amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Will have the clerk call the roll?
Mr. Gordon?
Here.
Mr. McLean?
Here.
Mr. Lowe?
Here.
Mr. Tevin?
Here.
Miss Adams?
Here.
Mr. Glenn?
Here.
Mrs. Miles?
Here.
And Mr. Nixon?
Here. First on the agenda is a public hearing for a rezoning at 720 South Cable Road. I'll have the clerk give the legal notice.
Notice is hereby given that on the 4th day of August, 2014, during the Lima City Council meeting scheduled at 7 p.m. in the council chambers located at 50 Town Square, Lima, Ohio, a public hearing will be held on the following manner. To change the applicable city zoning code for a parcel located southwest of Lima Central Catholic High School, 720 South Cable Road, within the city of Lima, Allen County, Ohio, to residential class 1. Save and accept the 30 by 96.10 foot access area. The petition is filed in order to secure a zoning designation that is consistent with the adjoining school properties. This petition is initiated by Richard D. Morrissey on behalf of the Lima Central Catholic Schools and has been endorsed by the City Planning Commission. Any interested person or persons desiring to be heard on said matter may do so at the time and place herein specified. The reports, maps, and other documents pertaining to the above request are on file in the office of the Clerk of Council and are open to public inspection.
Is there anybody in the audience that would like to speak to the issue of the rezoning of the property at the southwest corner of Lima Central Catholic High School on Mr. Morrissey,
I'm Richard
state your
Morrissey.
name and
I'm just
address.
here to present the board, and if there's any questions, to answer them. The property is being used as mostly our sports fields, and just trying to get the industrial, commercial, and R3 out of the area and make it all R1.
Okay.
So,
Right. Any
Some
questions
questions?
at all? Okay. Thank you. Is there anybody else, excuse me, in the audience that would like to speak to the issue of the rezoning? Third and final call. Is there anybody in the audience that would like to speak to the issue of the rezoning at 720 South Cable Road? Seeing none, I'll declare the public hearing closed. Next is the consent calendar.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin.
I move that item A of the consent calendar be received, filed, and approved, and item B be received and filed.
Second.
The motion, the second, is to receive, file, and approve item A, and to receive and file item B. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion carries. Communication number 1.
From the Director of Community Development regarding legislation to place tax assessments.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn.
I move that communication number 1, receive and file legislation on the night agenda.
Second.
The motion, the second, is to receive and file communication number 1. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 2.
From the Director of Community Development regarding legislation to place demolition assessments.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn.
I move that communication number 2, receive and file legislation on the night agenda.
Second.
The motion, the second, is to receive and file communication number 2. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 3.
From the Finance Director regarding legislation for budget amendments.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin.
I move that communication number 3 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion, the second, is to receive and file communication number 3. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries. Communication number 4.
From Ohio State University regarding capital projects.
Mr. President,
Mrs. Miles.
I move that communication number 4 be received and filed.
Second.
The motion on the second is to receive and file communication number 4. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 5.
From Acting Chief Protzman regarding legislation to accept a Safe Neighborhood Anti-Heroin Grant.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon.
I move that communication number 5 be received and filed, and legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion on the second is to receive and file communication number 5. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 6.
From the City Engineer regarding legislation to enter into a contract with Hume Supply.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that communication number 6 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 6. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 7.
From the City Engineer regarding legislation to amend the contract with D.L. Steiner.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that communication number 7 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 7. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Ordinance 172-14.
Amending the 2014 annual budget.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin.
I move that ordinance 172-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 172 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes?
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Miss Adams?
Yes.
Ordinance 172-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 173-14.
Levying special assessments for property maintenance code charges on premises in the city of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn.
I move that 173-14, ordinance 173-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 173-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion?
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I neglected in pre-council to ask Ms. Odom, did you get a total for this? Okay, thank you.
Is there any further discussion? Will the clerk call the roll?
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes?
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Miss Adams?
Yes.
Ordinance 173-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 174-14.
Levying a special assessment for demolition charges for dangerous structures in the city of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn.
I move that ordinance 174-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 174-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes?
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Miss Adams?
Yes.
Ordinance 174-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 175-14.
Authorizing the mayor to dispose of non-functional miscellaneous computer equipment.
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
I move that ordinance 175-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 175-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? We'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Miss Adams?
Yes.
Ordinance 175-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 176-14.
Authorizing the mayor to accept a donation of real property.
Mr. President,
Mr. Love.
I move that ordinance number 176-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 176-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Miss Adams?
Yes.
Ordinance 176-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 177-14.
Authorizing the mayor to accept a donation of real property.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lowe.
I move that ordinance 177-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 177-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Miss Adams.
Yes.
Ordinance 177-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 178-14.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into an agreement with the Lima City School District Board of Education.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lowe.
I move that ordinance 178-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 178-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion?
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
for those out in the audience and on TV, this is a donation of land back and forth between the city, the A.R. Hale Foundation. We're gonna have a park, a new park. So, it's gonna be over by the stadium, and I think it's gonna make a very beautiful entrance into our city. So, thank you, President.
Thank you, Mr. McLean. Is there any further discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Miss Adams.
Yes.
Ordinance 178-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 179-14.
Authorizing the mayor to accept and administer a Safe Neighborhood Anti-Heroin Initiative grant.
Mr. President,
Mr. Gordon.
I move that ordinance 179-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 179-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Miss Adams.
Yes.
Ordinance 179-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 180-14.
Authorizing the mayor to accept and expend an award from the AEP Ohio Energy Savers Program.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that ordinance 180-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 180-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion?
Mr. President.
Mr. McLean.
I really want to thank our administration and Rick Stolley. He spearheaded a lot of this to get this grant from AEP. You did a lot of work, and I know you did. So kudos to you. You did a fantastic job of maintaining that, keeping track of it, and telling us and beating on us, trying to get people to sign up, and we appreciate that. Thank you.
Is there any further discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Miss Adams.
Yes.
Ordinance 180-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 181-14.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with Bluffton Paving, Inc.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that ordinance 181-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 181-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion?
Mr. President,
Mr. Lowe.
this past week, I put in a phone call trying to get some answers to the streets that were going to get paved, and some of those that were denied. I did not receive a return phone call, and I was wanting maybe to know if Mr. Elstra could speak on this. I've had a couple conversations and kind of agreed not to agree, but the bottom line is on this particular street that I keep harping about is Pennsylvania Avenue. It's about 400 feet, not more than 500 feet, definitely not bigger than that. It is a small area, but the road does see a lot of traffic. It is horrific. And in comparison to some of the other streets that were on the list, the other streets look immaculate. This past week, there were workers out there. They did patch some of the major holes. They spent quite a while out there patching the holes, but again, if you see it, it's just, you just keep patching and patching and patching and patching, and it's a bad street. I'm asking, because we're seeing right here that this project is not to exceed $886,000, rounded, give or take a couple dollars. I'm asking again publicly, because I want them to know that I have been asking. can they please, if there's any leftover whatsoever, do this road? Because it's bad, and we're asked every year to turn in streets that we feel may need looked at. This is the same street I've been doing for 3 years outside of Grant Street on the east side of Schoonover Pool. So if at all possible, could you please, I want them to hear that from your mouth, Mr. Elstro, that street will not be getting paved, that I've been told.
Mr. Elstro.
Mr. Lowe is correct. He has been asking for a couple of years to have Pennsylvania Avenue, which is about a 10-foot wide strip of asphalt that serves primarily as an alley. There is one house that is served off of that stretch of Pennsylvania Avenue, and it is not in good shape. It's regarded by myself as an alley because it serves primarily the back lots of properties off of Wayne Street. And it is not in good condition, but our policy has been with alleys is that the property owners can take advantage of the alley paving program, and whereby the city will foot part of the bill if they purchase the asphalt. And in the big scheme of things, of all the roadways that we have to work and service throughout the city, we rank them by condition as well as the ADT, the average daily traffic that is those streets service. And I have to tell you, there's many more streets that are heavily used in very bad condition that do not appear on our list as well. So from our point of view, it is a matter of priority. I feel, yes, that one homeowner is not pleased, and I certainly will assure all of council and your property owner that you have been making pleas to us to resurface that street. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any more discussion? Have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Miss Adams?
Yes.
Ordinance 181-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 182-14.
Authorizing the mayor to apply for, accept, and administer an Ohio EPA FFY 2015 Section 319H grant.
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
I move that ordinance 182-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 182-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Miss Adams?
Yes.
Ordinance 182-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 183-14.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with Hefe Engineering.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that ordinance 183-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 183-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Miss Adams?
Yes.
Ordinance 183-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 184-14.
An ordinance amending number 20412.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams.
I move that ordinance 184-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 184-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion?
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
spoke earlier today with Mr. Elstro, in looking at the figures. This is 20% overrun on this contract, and I felt the committee, which I chair, Public Works, should have had some notice of the history of this. I obtained the history and this evening, but I'd like Mr. Elstro to speak to this, please.
Mr. President,
Mr. Elstro?
this project was for engineering services for the Hall of Justice and Municipal Center generator. Currently, there's insufficient emergency power for the Hall of Justice and the courts, and there's no backup power for this building. So this has been on the planning table for quite a while. Specifically, the engineering study began in 2012 and wound up just this past month, and we are scheduled for this fall to have a backup generator that will service both buildings and take care of the emergency needs of operations for the administrative, the hall of the police department, as well as the courts. There were 5 different questions that we posted with the engineering firm over the duration of this time that the engineering study was being conducted. They initially whipped up their design for the generator fairly quickly, but because of inability of Dominion Gas to supply fuel for the generator, we had to change it to diesel. Because Utilities DSG had decided to use the second floor for the backup side of the server, because there were structural concerns that we had for the original placement that was going to be in the exercise room over the exercise yard of the old city jail, and relocating that, and noise and vibration and those servers. We asked the engineering firm for 5 different additional components of study beyond the original. We were, in the end, $2,900 over the 10%. In retrospect, that is in violation of the guidance that your council has given us. You want us to come back when we do reach that 10%. I apologize for that. I'll be trying to be more prudent in the future to bring these things to your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Elstro. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ms. Adams and Mr. Elstro. Is there any further discussion? Will the clerk call the roll?
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Ms. Adams?
Yes.
184-14, I'm sorry, ordinance 184-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 185-14.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with Human Supply, Inc. for the demolition of 217 South Pierce Street.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that ordinance 185-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 185-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? Will the clerk call the roll?
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Ordinance 185-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 186-14.
Authorizing the mayor to accept and expend state capital improvement funds.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that ordinance 186-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 186-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? Will the clerk call the roll?
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Ordinance 186-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 187-14.
Amending the city zoning code from first industrial class 3 residential and business 2 to residential class 1 for a parcel located west of 720 South Cable Road in the city of Lima as herein described.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin?
I move that ordinance 187-14 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 187-14 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? Will the clerk call the roll?
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mrs. Miles?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Gordon?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
And Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Ordinance 187-14 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Miscellaneous business, Mr. Glenn.
Yes, I got a couple of things here. First of all, I want to thank Mr. Stolly. I appreciate all the work he done for Simmons Field. And that was $75,000 and where Lima Locals at. And I mean, he went very hard for it. And a lot of folks is so happy to go by there and see that. I had a conversation with some folks when I was out to eat dinner at the church, and they were like, boy, that's a beautiful, it looked way better than Shawnee Field. So I let them know how hard Mr. Stolley worked for this, you know, trying to get the people to sign and making sure everything right. And thank you so much, because you made that area picked up a lot, and folks don't know that's in the 6th Ward. And a lot of people's over there are so excited about it. I haven't heard no one say anything about the traffic, but I was a little upset when they lost, though, because I was looking for them to win it all. And it was great. The crowds was nice, and I just got to give you ups on that, because that's a lot of work to get people to do that, to get on their computer. Everybody know how he had to do it. It took me a while to explain it, but he got it done. Thank you again. Also, pre-council, we talked about it, so the folks watching about the grass on the railroad tracks. Our president of City Council will be proposing something for that. This is federal. It's not like code enforcement can go out and cut the grass, or you can call Councilman Glenn to go out there and weed it down. So I thank our president for coming up with a solution for this. So he will be bringing that up hopefully tonight. So we're going to get that taken care of, and I appreciate everyone on that. Also, our night out. We got one downtown. Also, we're going to be doing the Benita Haynes Memorial Service. So we do this every year. And I appreciate the Hoover Park Neighborhood Association Southside for help sponsoring this. And we come out, and her mother come down to speak. And I know it's been a long time. It was on August the 6th that Benita Haynes had got murdered inside the Lima Correctional Institution. And she was a colleague of mine, so we keep that tradition going on for her. And we appreciate them 2 neighborhood associations that come out for that. We will be having bingo. I'll be getting free school supplies to the kids, hot dogs, face painting. So we appreciate all the neighborhood people coming out for that too, you know. And it's a lot of work, but they put it together, and they're willing to continue going. Thank you. Also, we're going to be doing a couple things on, you know, bringing some revival to the area. It's called Release the Glory to the City Revival. This is going to be 8 churches going to be involved in this, and they're going to start the 29th of August all the way to September 2nd, every night at 7 p.m. And it'll be Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night. And we got so many churches involved in that. They're going to be on. That will be there at Pastor Jefferson Church, right there on Reese Street. I will give more information out on that. But I'm glad she's having something like this. And, you know, a lot of things been going on. And I think we need to, you know, check a lot of things out and bring that out there. And I appreciate her putting this together. And I appreciate all the churches coming together for this. And it's just pretty big. And we want some, every night at 7 p.m. you come out and hear worship revival, you know. And I'm just so happy for that. I also want to thank the people in Miss Holly. That's the kid. That's the young lady mother who passed away in the car accident. She appreciated everyone who donated the money to bury her kid. And I thank you so much, folks, for coming out, showing your hometown pride. You know, I know some people don't need to last around, but, you know, when you see a child, we all help out. We all come. Lima always come together, and that was so great about it, you know. And I know I went around, and a lot of folks went around and got the money to help out. And her job helped out. And it's just so many good folks in Lima. And I thank you so much, because she was so happy, you know, when her kid, when that happened to her kid. And my last but not least, last month, and my goal was 10 jobs a month that I can go out and help find people employment. This month we got 20. So I appreciate all the plant manager I talked to, you know, jobs with folks, and we got some good jobs. And I'm going to continue going at it this week, and next week we're going to see what we got. But I went past the goal. It was 20, and it just made me feel so good when you go in these plants and talk to people, and they'll tell you how many people they need, and we got the folks willing to go out there and go to work, and that's what I want to see, you know. and the 4 volunteers I got. You know, nobody get no gas money. We all just going out. This is something we want to do. So I will be I appreciate the Wall Park area, and I don't have to call the jobs out. They know where they are in the Salina area. And I'll be going up to Defiance, and Joe Motors is one of the biggest one. I'll be meeting with the plant manager down there, setting up an appointment for that one. But it's so great when people are so happy that thank you and say, hey, as long as I get a chance, and that's what's happened there. And thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Glenn. Mrs. Miles?
Thank you, Mr. President. The Westgate Neighborhood Association will be meeting on August the 17th at 6:30 p.m. Chamberlain Huckery Funeral Home on Cable Road, and the speaker for the month of August will be Pete White, Property Maintenance. And I want to say congratulations to Councilor Lowe for being represented on the downtown Muriel down there. I went by there today to take a look at it after seeing it on television, and for his initiative, Drugs Bring Death. So a great depiction of what he tried to do during that time here. So beautiful Muriel all together here. It really is. It's in a good location.
Yes, it
when I
is.
go to get my QP, I'll be able to see it each time. So it's really a nice plus for our city. And I want us to continue to pray for our city, as there's been many deaths, you know, of young people this summer. And I just really want us to continue to pray that these kids will make better decisions in their lives. There is nothing worse than a parent having to bury their child. And so I really want us to just pray that this dark, temporary cloud, and I'm saying temporary because I believe it's temporary. You know, I'm not sure why things are happening right now the way they are and so quickly, but I just ask that we continue to lift our city up in prayer, and that that darkness will go away and the light will return. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Miles. Mr. Gordon?
I don't have anything tonight, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McLean?
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a couple items about the neighborhood night out tomorrow evening. I think this festivity starts around 6 o'clock in the square. We'll see the police department jumping down off the building, or fire department. We'll see them all out there having fun. We'll probably have the little robot out there. I'm sure if the chief's got anything to do with it, maybe 2. So bring your kids and come out. I think there's going to be some hamburgers, hot dogs, and things like that to eat. It's just a good way to mingle with your community. And remember to leave your porch lights on, because this is for our neighborhoods. This is for our safety for our neighborhoods, and that's what we're here for. Is we want to make sure we look out for each and every one. As Todd says, you know, be good to each other, and I think that's part of it. And especially the elderly, if they're not in and you don't see them for a while, go check on them, because it is important, especially during the summer and the winter. Just make sure they're okay. And the other thing that I want to talk about is, you guys missed it. Every one of you missed it this weekend. Probably some of you were downtown, but I'm telling you, you missed it, because Lima Live was awesome. That day, they had music, car shows, every place that had food or didn't have food, they had entertainment, they had food in the Civic Center, they had food up and down the streets at every place that was out there. It was amazing, and it was all very, very good. The quality of music was superb.
Yes.
Superb. And if you didn't like what was on, wait a couple hours, because it came up something different. And you know, you could see the crowd coming in and out, in and out, in and out the whole day. Car show all the way up and down Main Street. It was superb. So if you missed it, you missed out on a good time, because it was superb. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. McLean. Mr. Lowe?
Thank you, Mr. President. I've got a couple more questions concerning the downtown area. Not too long ago, we did a whole resurfacing of our sidewalks on Market Street, the repaving, and I've getting a lot of phone calls asking me what's going on. We've paid for sidewalks. Now you guys are digging them up. And I was wanting to know if Mr. Elstro could come forward. The message that I received is there was a lack of communication with us and the gas company. I don't know for sure. I need an answer that I can give back, especially for those that are watching.
Mr. President,
Mr. Elstro?
our local gas provider, Dominion Gas, has gone on a capital improvement program and spending a record amount of money in renewal of their lines throughout our community. I assure you that it's not for lack of communication that you see Dominion Gas installing their lines behind improvements that we have done. Our engineering division sends communications to Dominion. We try to meet with Dominion early spring, let them know our resurfacing schedule a year in advance, let them know that our capital improvements a year in advance. And they have known about the Weston Street and Elizabeth Street project for over 2 years. We have been talking with them, cautioning them not to cut our new pavement, and I better not see that being done.
Talk to me.
There are sections of the concrete sidewalks which they have disturbed. They are promising that they will be restored, and if you see sections that are not restored fully, you can contact us or Dominion Gas, either one, but we will make sure they follow up.
Okay, well, stay right there. The other thing is, I had some visitors from the state of Texas that came up. There was family reunions this weekend, and they was it was overjoyed about the downtown area and how businesses are starting to come back, and they felt a real good sense of pride. But they asked me one question, and I told them I would ask it publicly. The gazebo. They said, all these businesses look so nice, and then we got a gazebo whose roof looks ridiculous. And they was like, Jesse, could you please find out if there is any money out there that could get that roof fixed, get that mowed off, get repainted. We got businesses coming down, investing in the downtown area, and then we got, is there any plans for that, I guess, to be fixed?
Well, there are many new businesses coming down, and I have to tell you, I was had the opportunity to be invited to the Apollo Open House, who is now residing in the top 2 floors of the Enterprise building. And their staff was delighted with the ambiance and the atmosphere and what downtown has to offer. And we certainly do welcome them to the downtown. As to the point about the gazebo, Mr. Rick Stolley has been discussing this with a private individual who is interested in perhaps taking this project on. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details because the entity has not made the commitment yet, but Mr. Stolley has been talking about the roof replacement on the gazebo.
Okay.
Thank you.
The other thing is, there was a dance that was held over at the Bradfield Center this past Friday night. I think it was the first teen dance since 1989. It was very successful. Mr. Anthony Glover came from Cincinnati. He was like, you having a dance, I got to be the DJ, and he made his way up here, and I'm telling you, charged us almost nothing to do this. He had a great time. He did line dancing, the kids. It was a nice turnout, but I want to tell you guys, if you have never, ever seen Councilman Glenn dance, he is the Fred Astaire of Lima, Ohio. And I challenge you to watch it. But I want to thank him for his support. We had a fantastic night, and I had a lot of friends that turned up that I was not expecting, but they did a fine job. And I just want to say, on behalf of A New Dimension, the Ohio Association of Beauticians, we thank Lima and the youth for their support. There was absolutely no problems at all, and it was just a good night. So I just want to say thank you, and we will be continuing that in the near future. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Lowe. Mr. Tevin?
Just one thing this evening. I'd like to request, Amy, that we get an update on the junk auto officer activity.
Oh, yes.
Visually, I see it. I mean, I see the difference, and I'd just like to share those numbers publicly, because I think that it's been a real benefit to have the part-time officer handling that. I think he's done an excellent job. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tevin. Ms. Adams?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to make a motion to refer 2 issues to the Public Works Committee. The first issue is the foreclosure of property, a review and procedure review of that process.
Second.
Motion second is to refer to Public Works Committee the process of foreclosures. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries.
And the second issue I'd like to refer to the Public Works Committee, it came out of the Finance Committee, addressing the leases of various holdings of the city. And the issue of the renters making improvements, wanting assurance of their investment in the years going forward. So I would like to have that.
Second.
The motion the second is to refer the issue of lease agreements and occupant improvements. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed?
And
Motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. President. The last thing, I was sitting here and it dawned on me, we were talking about Simmons Field and all. The underpass on St. John's Avenue, I've seen some activity there of some new seating. One thing I noticed this past weekend when I was responding to a call was a strip of some stones that had been placed. My only issue I had with that is the size of the stones. I thought they were going to be a little larger unless those are temporary or to, I was hoping for larger than those that can be picked up and potentially thrown. So I don't know if Mr. Stolley or Mr. Elstro would like to address that, or
I have not been out there today, so I don't know what work was completed last week. But yes, there was a design that called for both reseeding of that bank as well as a couple of other of our steeper banks around town, and the stone was put in place. The stone is to be covered with resin so that it will be affixed in place, much like the stone around the tree planters in the downtown area.
great. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for that reminder. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. The only thing I have this evening is just to clarify what Mr. Glenn referenced. The issue has come up about the weeds along the easements that the railroad companies own, and the bottom line is, much like the crossings, it is governed by federal law and the PUCO. And there's nothing other than railing and verbally abusing them that any local or state government can do to get them to shape up. So there's no point in having any committee discussions on it because, frankly, it's going to be fruitless. But what I did suggest, and I have done, is authorized a resolution asking our state representatives and state senators to, our U.S. Congress and Senate representatives to take this up in Congress. Every other business, homeowner, landowner in a city and municipalities across Ohio and this country have generally to keep some upkeep, some expectation, some responsibility to keep their properties up. The fact that they are allowed to get away with crossings that are just absolutely abhorrent, that they are allowed to let weeds grow 6, 8, 10 feet tall, enough to hide Derry Glenn. Yeah, that was his words. He said that, they're taller than him. And then when they do cut them down, which is rare, they simply leave these 4 and 5 and 6 foot stems of weeds laying there in haymows, basically alongside the tracks, which then collect any other kind of trash, harbor rodents, etc. And then the neighbors get the joy of dealing with that leftover fodder. So we're going to start. Who knows where it will go, but you know what? Someone's got to start it, so we're going to, and that resolution should be coming to us sometime in the next several weeks. So that's what, it's not a magic bullet. I don't want anybody to think that all of a sudden by the 1st of September, everything is going to be mowed and trimmed and the crossings are going to be peaceful. But it's a start, and we'll follow it up after we pass it by sending it to other communities in Ohio, asking them to pass similar resolutions. but the railroads should have some responsibility as landowners to the communities which they have rails going through. So that's what we have done. Other than that, I don't have anything else. Is there
Mr.
any-
President,
Mr. Tevin?
I move the Lima City Council adjourn until 7 PM, August 18th, in these chambers.
Second.
Motion the second is that Lima City Council adjourn until August 18th at 7 PM. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. We are adjourned.